Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? I thought not. It's not a story the Jedi would tell you. Those were the very words Sheev Palpatine used to lure Anakin Skywalker to the dark side of the Force. And it was the same Darth Plagueis that set up the final part of the grand plan of the Sith as the Master of Palpatine to eventually bring the Republic and the Jedi Order to fall. Chapter 1. Prelude to Birth. Long before Plagueis was born, Darth Tenebrous was the secret Dark Lord of the Sith, who was working as a starship designer named Rugus Gnome. He was a Bith, and the latest Sith Lord that came from the long lineage of Darth Bane's rule of two. He had just killed his own master as he felt that he was the most suited to carry the grand plan of the Sith forward, the plan to destroy the Republic. Tenebrous at that time had already begun diving deep into the dark art of possessing another body by manipulating the Midi-Chlorians. He wanted his consciousness to survive until the creation of the Chosen One, a prophesied person to bring balance to the Force. So, he set out on a quest to find a suitable and powerful apprentice talented enough to one day serve as his vessel. One day, he came across a Force-sensitive moon named Damask, a middle-ranking banking clan agent. Tenebrous contemplated if he would be suitable as an apprentice, but ultimately deemed the moon not suitable as an apprentice. Years later, the Sith Lord still hasn't found a suitable apprentice, but discovered a lower caste female moon who was also Force-sensitive. She wasn't strong enough in the Force, but she was useful enough to Tenebrous, who took her under his wing as a disciple. According to his calculations, an offspring between this woman and Damask would produce a disciple powerful in the Force. For that purpose, Tenebrous ordered his disciple to seduce Damask in the hopes of hearing a child. Chapter 2. Early Life of Hego Damask. Tenebrous' disciple succeeded, so somewhere between 200 and 100 BBY, the moon known as Hego Damask was born as the son of Damask, who had become Midi-Chlorians' administrator. Hego didn't have a normal childhood though, not only because he was the son of a powerful figure, but also because he was bred and raised by his mother to become a Sith apprentice for Tenebrous. His mother recorded every detail of his childhood, knowing completely well it was her mission to prepare Hego to be Tenebrous' apprentice. She allowed him to explore the deepest and darkest corners of his feelings, one of the Sith's sources of power. Hego also grew up with playmates his mother picked for him, to observe his interactions with them, and just before he turned 5, he discovered his gifts with the Force. But he did not do so by accidentally making a stone float or having visions of the future. Instead, Hego learned that he could use his powers to manipulate the feelings of his playmates. At one point, he experimented with these powers, using them to influence one of his playmates he disliked to commit suicide. Upon discovering her son's potential, Hego's mother revealed to him that they had the same gifts, and that they needed to keep this a secret. Intrigued by his mother's words, the young Damask went along with his mother's wishes, believing his unique gifts needed to be kept in the dark. But at the same time, he also thought his mother simply wanted what was best for him. Eventually, his parents handed him over to Tenebrous, as was planned by him. Tenebrous gave his father an opportunity to advance his career through his network, and Hego's mother was always loyal to the Dark Lord of the Sith. The young Damask left Midi-Chlorians for the first time in his life, becoming Darth Plagueis upon assuming his role as Tenebrous' apprentice. Damask, thanks to Tenebrous' help, eventually became so powerful that he rose to the top as the chairman of the banking clan. Meanwhile, Hego's mother disappeared without a trace, having already fulfilled her mission to produce and prepare a child for her master. 5 years later, Plagueis learned of everything that led to his birth and eventual fate as the new Sith apprentice. He had mixed feelings about this revelation because he didn't know what to think of being a product of his master's machinations. His fate wasn't his own, even before his birth. But at the same time, he also believed he had a special place as a Sith Lord, especially when he was designed for this very purpose. Chapter 3. Darth Tenebrous' Apprentice. Plagueis lived a sheltered life before leaving Midi-Chlorians for the first time, but traveling with Tenebrous as his apprentice allowed him to acquaint himself with the backwater areas of the galaxy, especially in the Outer Rim territories. He and his master went on different missions where they sowed discontent and chaos in systems around the galaxy to weaken the Republic in time for the return of the Sith to power. During the early part of his apprenticeship, Plagueis learned the basics of the dark side and how to use the Force. But Tenebrous also taught him how to be cunning, deceitful, and manipulative throughout their travels. It was important for Tenebrous to build a strong network of future allies they could call upon when the time was right for the Sith to take their place at the center of the galaxy. To that end, he wanted Plagueis to eventually take on his public persona as Hego Damask, a wealthy industrialist who used his family's fortune and influence to help Tenebrous grow his inner circle. Despite that, he was yet to become a true Sith apprentice, for he was yet to show his unwavering allegiance to the dark side. Plagueis needed to be tested, and Tenebrous believed the best way to challenge his apprentice's resolve was to make him commit the ultimate act that showed his lack of empathy: killing someone. Tenebrous tasked him with assassinating Karad Santh the Elder, a powerful industrialist with a large share in one of the biggest weapons manufacturing companies in the galaxy. Santh had wronged Tenebrous in the past after scamming him out of a starship deal, so it was like hitting two birds with one stone for him. On one hand, he would exact his revenge on Santh. On the other end, the assassination would prove whether or not Plagueis was ready to kill someone in cold blood. Knowing he needed to be subtle with his approach, Plagueis used the Force to choke Karad to death during a banquet. It was after his first real murder that Plagueis truly understood the allure of the dark side of the Force. This wasn't the first time he took a life. After all, he manipulated a child into committing suicide when he was just a kid himself. But outright killing someone for the first time was a different feeling that ultimately made him stronger in the dark side. Soon after that, his father, Car Damask, had fallen ill and died to a congenital disease. This meant that the head of Damask Holdings was open and up for grabs. Getting access to the vast funds and resources would be advantageous for the Sith. Plagueis thus returned to Munilinst, the banking clan's home planet, to meet the rest of his clan. However, because he was the son of Damask's second wife, his half-siblings never accepted him, even seeking to have him disinherited. He learned, however, that the disease his father had died of affected all his children, except for Plagueis, who was born from a different mother. Plagueis used this to his advantage. He hired a geneticist to conduct fake treatments on all of his half-siblings. One by one, all of his brothers and sisters fell to their deaths, with Plagueis rejoicing after getting the last laugh. Through that, Plagueis became the sole head of the Damask family, inheriting his father's massive fortune and influence. This included becoming the leader of the Sojourn Gatherings, which were secret gatherings involving industrialists, political leaders, and gangsters. Plagueis used this power over these leaders to his advantage by influencing them in preparation for the eventual fall of the Republic. However, while he may have risen in power and influence, Plagueis' training in the ways of the dark side was progressing slowly. Tenebrous never wanted him to become a powerful Sith Lord. Instead, he focused Plagueis' training on his mastery over Midi-Chlorian manipulation. The goal was to teach his apprentice how to extend and preserve his own life in preparation for the coming of the Chosen One. In Tenebrous' eyes, Plagueis was never meant to be a true Sith apprentice. He was only supposed to be Tenebrous' temporary vessel until he could possess the Chosen One decades into the future. To that end, Tenebrous took on another apprentice he named Darth Venomous, whose existence remained a secret to Plagueis. Venomous was supposed to be Tenebrous' true apprentice in accordance with the Rule of Two. Tenebrous favored him because Venomous was also a Bith, allowing them to share the same level of intelligence. What Tenebrous was unaware of was that Plagueis was secretly honing his talents in the dark side of the Force. After all, he was working for the advancement of the Grand Plan, the Sith's ultimate goal of taking over the galaxy and destroying the Jedi. He understood he needed to be at his most powerful to finally see the plan coming to fruition during his lifetime, knowing only a powerful Sith could actually stand up against the Jedi Order. Plagueis wanted to stay true to the Grand Plan, the one goal the Sith envisioned nearly 1,000 years ago. His master, however, didn't want him to be powerful out of fear that possessing him would become more troublesome. Tenebrous was more concerned about envisioning his place as the most powerful being in the galaxy by ultimately taking over the Chosen One through his apprentice's body. But Plagueis grew to levels far beyond what his master originally intended, opening up an inevitable clash between master and apprentice, especially with both Sith Lords pursuing two different goals. Chapter 4. Betraying Tenebrous. In 67 BBY, Darth Tenebrous learned of a cortosis deposit on the planet Baldemnik. Cortosis is a valuable metal that can temporarily short out a lightsaber upon contact, making it useful for the Sith in their inevitable clash with the Jedi. Tenebrous wanted to personally inspect the source and went there with Plagueis and an M2 mining probe. But what they didn't know was that the same probe had been sabotaged. As much as Tenebrous was trying to increase the Sith's influence, he still had enemies lurking everywhere. Chief among them were industrial rivals, such as the Subtext Mining Group, that wanted to take out as many competitors as they could. Knowing Nome and Damask could affect their profits if they were to mine the Cortosis pocket, Subtext Mining loaned them a drone programmed to kill them when the time was right. Meanwhile, the Sith Lords set out to survey the Cortosis vein using special suits designed to protect them from the extremely hot temperatures of the planet. For Tenebrous, this was an important part of Sith history. He thought this mission was going to end the circle of the Rule of Two, a rule that Darth Bane started almost 1,000 years ago. Bane started this rule on his way to the Apatros Cortosis mine, so for Tenebrous, there was a great significance in how he and his apprentice were on a similar mission involving Cortosis. He believed this mission was set to end the rule, especially since he had already broken it by taking on another apprentice aside from Plagueis. The two made their way deeper into the chasm until they came across a highly combustible variant of lethane gas near the Cortosis pocket. Suddenly, the probe turned on them, and with a little flame, igniting the gas in the chasm. The entire cave exploded in fire, forcing the Sith Lords to escape through the burning caverns. As they were making their escape, Plagueis noticed something odd. His master was acting out of character, seemingly distressed and worried. He had never seen Tenebrous in this state before, making Plagueis believe his master sensed something alarming in the Force. Upon reaching their ships, the gas explosion caught up to them. The ceiling was collapsing around them. Tenebrous used the Force to shield them from the fireball and held the collapsing ceiling back. Suddenly, the dark side of the Force spoke to Plagueis. This was his chance to finally take his place as the Master. Plagueis saw his master was at his most vulnerable, with one hand preventing the explosion from reaching them, while the other kept the ceiling from collapsing on their ship. In a split-second decision, Plagueis used the Force to collapse the ceiling over Tenebrous. Overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the rocks crashing down on him, the Bith was buried under the rubble, with his body and bones crushed. Tenebrous realized quickly that his apprentice wanted to take his place right then and there. Although the ceiling collapsing was subtle enough that it could have just been a result of the explosion. Plagueis rushed to Tenebrous' side, sensing that he was barely clinging on to life. Plagueis still felt the need to act like it was an accident, and tried to comfort his master. Tenebrous went along with Plagueis' act, bestowing the mantle of Dark Lord of the Sith to him. Now, Plagueis was the Sith Master tasked with carrying out the Grand Plan. When Tenebrous coughed up after bestowing the title, Plagueis still felt like he should admit his betrayal, stating that Tenebrous had it coming, as was the Sith tradition, and that Tenebrous' death would be the end of the Rule of Two. Plagueis then snapped his master's neck, killing him definitely. Plagueis had done it. His master was no more. He reached out through the Force to study his former master's Midi-Chlorians, which he felt dying in the Bith's body. Both of them had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Plagueis wanted to take his master's place in order to carry out the Grand Plan without having to follow the Banite system of Rule of Two, as he sought to break the cycle of having his apprentice kill him, and then so on and so forth. Unbeknownst to him, though, Tenebrous had also been preparing for this moment for a long time now. The Bith Sith Lord's experimentations with Midi-Chlorians had all led up to this moment. He had infected himself with a retrovirus that took away his precognition, the ability to see into the future or sense danger through the Force. But the same retrovirus turned his Midi-Chlorians into something he called Maxi-Chlorians, which carried the essence of his soul. So, as Plagueis was studying the dying Midi-Chlorians of his former master, Tenebrous' Maxi-Chlorians snuck into his former apprentice's body through an open wound on the back of his neck. This was Tenebrous' plan all along. The Maxi-Chlorians were supposed to take over Plagueis' body, replacing the moon's soul with Tenebrous' essence. As Tenebrous' conscience slowly infected Plagueis, he reached out and accessed Plagueis' foresight to take a glimpse into the future. Shocked, he realized a horrifying fate awaited him. Tenebrous got hit with a vision where he saw that Plagueis would not live to see the rise of the Chosen One. Instead, he would die at the hands of his apprentice, the one he called the Shadow. Tenebrous was always obsessed with reshaping the future. He wanted to be the one to lead the Sith during the coming of the Chosen One. But he always feared his own mortality, knowing the Chosen One would never come during his lifetime. He already knew his fate as merely one of the many Sith Lords who died at the hands of their own apprentices. The only problem is that his many visions in the past revealed to him that he was never going to be the one to lead the Sith's return to dominance. Instead, he saw visions of a shadowy figure bringing about the fall of the Jedi. But in his arrogance, he always thought that that shadowy figure would be himself. That was why he sought to change his fate. But seeing the shadow killing Plagueis in this vision made him understand that he could never escape his fate, even if he were to take over his apprentice's body. Out of panic, he escaped the moon's body. In doing so, his Midi-Chlorians were trapped in that dark cave, leaving his soul to wander in this dark part of the galaxy forever. The aftermath of the infection, however, on Plagueis was that it did diminish his foresight abilities in the Force greatly, an ability that might have helped him sense his own eventual doom at the hands of this mysterious shadowy figure. Thus, Tenebrous had damned them both. Chapter 5. Life after Tenebrous. First, though, Plagueis still had to escape the cavern he was trapped in. He may have succeeded at killing his master by forcing the ceiling to cave in on them, but it was at the cost of losing their ships. He could not repair any damage the ship suffered. Also, the wound on his neck was infected, leaving him in a weak and battered state. He took Tenebrous's lightsaber and assured himself that the incident looked like an accident. Then, he used the Force to clear the rubble and create a pile of rocks high enough to climb out of the deep caverns. Hoping to find the nearest starport, the Sith Lord went on a long trek with little to no resources. At night, he took shelter in caves while replaying the events of the day in his head in an attempt to sleep. Suddenly, while doing so, he felt the presence of a being that nearly equaled his power. For him, this was impossible because, as far as he knew, he was the only Sith Lord alive. But Plagueis dismissed this as Tenebrous's soul haunting him. After all, he had read stories of past Sith Lords haunting Darth Bane for desecrating the tomb of the Dark Lords. As hard as the trek to the nearest starport was, the moon escaped by sneaking into a transport ship and eventually killing the crew, except for a medical droid called 11-4D. The droid nursed him back to health and navigated the ship to a planet friendly to Damask holdings. Having grown fond of the droid, Plagueis decided to bring him along with him. 4D eventually became an indispensable part of Plagueis' retinue. Upon his return to his home world, Plagueis initiated the annual Sojourn Gatherings, consolidating more power to Damask holdings. To protect himself from any assassination attempts, he hired the Sun Guard, a powerful group of Thursian mercenaries known for rivaling the Mandalorians in strength and ferocity. During the gathering, however, the same dangerous being he sensed after killing Tenebrous had found its way to Sojourn. Plagueis' Sun Guard informed him of an intruder who managed to get past security. Understanding that no ordinary being could have easily made his way through the Sun Guard, Plagueis realized this could have only been done by a powerful Force user. At that moment, he decided to meet this intruder in the planet's forests. He initially thought only a Jedi could be powerful enough in the Force to threaten him and break through the Sun Guard. But upon seeing this intruder igniting his red lightsaber, he realized he was facing something far more dangerous than a mere Jedi. Before him stood a Bith, the shadow of his former master. Plagueis was confused. It couldn't be Tenebrous. He had killed him, and even studied the Midi-Chlorians leaving his body. He thought this must have been an artificial clone created through his former master's scientific experiments. This Bith, however, denied the possibility that he was but a mere clone. Instead, he claimed himself to be Darth Venomous, the true apprentice chosen by Tenebrous himself. And his final mission to legitimize his claim to being a Sith Lord was to kill Darth Plagueis. I am Darth Venomous. Darth, we'll see about that. Your death will legitimize the title, Plagueis. In what was a short but fierce duel, the two disciples of Tenebrous fought in what seemed like a stalemate. Venomous used the very same fighting style Plagueis used because Tenebrous thought doing so would give him an advantage over the Moon Sith. Plagueis struggled but eventually gained the upper hand by disarming the imposter Sith Lord. With Venomous down on his knees, he begged Plagueis to take him in as his new Sith apprentice. Instead, Plagueis had other plans. Plagueis forced Venomous to poison himself with a comatose-inducing substance, having Venomous fall into a deep coma. The goal was to use the powerful Sith imposter's body for his Midi-Chlorian experiments because Force users as powerful as he was were far too rare and valuable. But upon investigating Venomous's ship, Plagueis learned that his rival had kept a record of the names and locations of other Force-sensitive people who had the potential to be his apprentice. But instead of seeing those Force-sensitive individuals as potential apprentices, Plagueis saw them as rivals to his position as the Dark Lord of the Sith. He wanted to solidify his place as the only true Sith Lord in the galaxy, unwilling to see any other Force-sensitive individual growing in the dark side and threatening his power. So, he sought to eliminate those potential rivals, starting by incapacitating a Shido skin shifter. Then, on the planet Seleucami, he encountered an Iktalchi prophet, who used the power of the Force to see into the future and predict the fall of both the Republic and the Jedi Order. She was sharing her visions with her followers until Plagueis arrived to interrupt her, telling the prophet that her message could potentially disrupt his plans. While the prophet assured the moon that she would undo her words, Plagueis used Force lightning to murder her in front of her followers. Then he went to the planet Abraxan to hunt down an Autolan named Not Lair, who had killed dozens of people there. But while Plagueis could have easily defeated Lair, there was a bigger problem. The Jedi Master Nikata and his Padawan Lobuk were also on the planet to investigate the murders. This was Plagueis' first true encounter with a Jedi in the flesh, but instead of confronting them, he hid his Force abilities to keep the existence of the Sith a secret. It was not yet time for him to reveal that the Sith had been hiding in plain sight all along, and confronting the Nikata and her Padawan would only complicate the situation. Plagueis, however, found Lair first and identified himself as the Sith Master. He realized he could kill two birds with one stone, telling Lair he would take him in as his apprentice if he could kill the Jedi on that planet. If Lair were to kill them, Plagueis would have the opportunity to train a promising apprentice. But if the Jedi were to kill Lair, they would do Plagueis' work for him. True enough, Lair was no match for the Jedi, who struck him down in a brief duel. Plagueis succeeded without having to reveal his true powers to the Jedi. The now undisputed Dark Lord of the Sith had succeeded in eliminating every Force-sensitive prospect Venomous had been scouting to be his successor. But like any Sith Lord who had to adhere to the rule of two, he still eventually needed to take on an apprentice. His wish shall soon be fulfilled, though, as the dark side of the Force would come to steer his course toward the man who would eventually orchestrate the downfall of democracy. Chapter 6. Sheev Palpatine. Believing he had already wiped out anyone who posed a threat to his grand plan of one day destroying both the Republic and the Jedi Order, Plagueis went to Naboo to investigate the political scene there. At that time, he was more interested in politics, thinking that obtaining political and industrial power would help make his plans sail smoother. Damask Holdings supported Bon Topolo, a liberal candidate who wanted to open Naboo up to the rest of the galaxy and fully integrate it with the Republic. Plagueis believed that opening Naboo was best for his plans, because he wanted to use it as one of his future bases, while also profiting from the rich plasma resources that were recently discovered on the planet. On the other end of the electoral ring was someone who wanted to keep Naboo closed off to most of the galaxy to focus more on internal development. This rival of Topolo was heavily supported by a rich nobleman called Kasinga Palpatine, who used his family fortune to support his campaigns. But there was drama brewing within House Palpatine. Plagueis learned that Topolo had been secretly working with the 17-year-old son of none other than Kasinga himself. Sheev Palpatine had been secretly feeding information to Topolo because he was vehemently against his own father's beliefs. Curious about this young man, Plagueis took this chance to meet Sheev to get to know more about this treacherous young member of the Legislative Youth Program, an organization that honed youths interested in entering public service. Damask sought Palpatine out at the Theed University, convincing him to give him a tour of the city. But what initially surprised him during their first meeting was that he couldn't sense Sheev in the Force. Intrigued, his interest in the young man tickled his curiosity even more, as he asked questions about Palpatine's viewpoints and relationship with his family. The Sith Lord learned of the young Palpatine's sour relationship with his father because of their different political opinions. Sheev wanted Naboo to open itself to the galaxy, contradicting Kasinga's isolationist stand. More importantly, he learned that Sheev was motivated by his ambition to see Naboo becoming part of the greater galaxy. This was the very reason why he undermined his father's political goals. Plagueis was impressed by his ambition and intelligence, both traits that the Sith Lord felt were necessary to achieve power. To that end, he offered to use Sheev as a spy to secure Topolo's victory and Damask Holdings' interest in Naboo. The young Palpatine agreed under one condition, that he would report his findings to Plagueis alone and directly. Sheev had never had an older figure he could trust with his ideas and ambitions. He and Kosinga never saw eye to eye in relation to their political views, eventually contributing to their estrangement. But the way Plagueis showed interest in his potential and viewpoints convinced him he had an ally he could rely on. Meanwhile, the Moon Sith thought Palpatine saw him as the father figure he never had because he became the young man's only confidant. Plagueis went through days thinking about Sheev and even considered grooming him into the Supreme Chancellor under the control of the Sith when it was time to initiate the Grand Plan. But while Damask's relationship with the young Palpatine was flourishing, the father wasn't happy. On his second visit to Naboo, Plagueis received a stern warning from Kosinga to stay away from Naboo and his son. The head of House Palpatine had spies reporting to him that Damask and Sheev were growing closer, but Kosinga wasn't motivated by jealousy. Instead, he hated how his own son was communicating with one of his political rival's biggest supporters. Damask working closely with Sheev would undermine Kosinga's political stand, weakening his isolationist position. The Dark Lord, however, was undeterred by the politician's warnings. He eventually went to Chandrila to meet with Sheev, who was on a retreat sponsored by the Legislative Youth Program. Upon learning about Kosinga's warnings to Damask, the younger Palpatine was angry at his father for trying to meddle in his personal affairs. That release of anger made Plagueis realize even more just how powerful Sheev was. The Sith Lord felt Palpatine's sheer rage through the Force, making him understand that this young man was not only ambitious and powerful, but also extraordinarily strong in the Force. Sheev, meanwhile, eventually revealed that he sought ultimate power, the very same thing every Sith Lord always wanted to obtain. With that, Plagueis saw the chance to finally break the chain attaching the young Palpatine to his family. Plagueis convinced him he was willing to be his ally as long as Palpatine was also willing to free himself of the burdens and restrictions that held him down, including his own father. Plagueis then manipulated Palpatine into confronting his father by using his own story of how he killed his siblings to inherit the entire Damask Holdings estate. He also knew that Kosinga's spies were everywhere, including Chandrila. Plagueis not only convinced Sheev to grow angrier at his father and try to take over House Palpatine, but also provided Kosinga a reason to confront his son. The collision between the Palpatine father and son was inevitable, and all it required was one spark to ignite the flames brewing amongst them. As Palpatine was ready to leave for Naboo, one of his father's security guards escorted him to the family's starship. Kosinga confronted Sheev about his political views and relationship with Damask. The elder Palpatine decided to keep his son away from the elections by sending him to Chamel Minor, a planet near Naboo. Not wanting to be sent away, Sheev poured out years of pent-up frustrations in a verbal altercation that forced Kosinga to tell his son he wanted him dead from the very start. With all his rage ready to explode, Sheev instinctively drew upon the power of the dark side, killing the entire Palpatine family and the security guards single-handedly. Soon after the incident, he called Damask to help him destroy any evidence that led to him. Plagueis fainted the worried father figure, but rejoiced on the inside. After having killed every single one of Venmus's prospective apprentices, deeming them unworthy, Palpatine was finally someone who had everything he was looking for. He was the perfect Sith apprentice. Plagueis took Palpatine in, revealing the nature of the Sith to him and how together they could achieve ultimate power. Palpatine knelt before him and swore his undying loyalty to the Sith. And due to the insidious nature of his new apprentice, Plagueis branded him the Sith name Darth Sidious. Taking on an apprentice was one thing, but training one was an entirely different challenge. Plagueis never underwent the right Sith training from Tenebrous decades before meeting Palpatine. He received the basic training that allowed him to hone his powers in the dark side of the Force, but Tenebrous mostly sent him on nonsense missions while diverting his training toward Midi-Chlorian control. Instead, Plagueis had to train his powers on his own, without his former master's consent. This time, however, he was dead set on training Sidious the right way, knowing that his apprentice was going to be the key to initiating the grand plan that Darth Bane had dreamt of nearly 1,000 years back. The first part of Sidious's training was designed to break him. Plagueis wanted his apprentice to kill his old self as Sheev Palpatine and remake him as Darth Sidious. This involved training so severe that it could potentially kill him, but the master did promise the apprentice one thing, that they would be free of the rule of two at the end of it all. That meant they would not keep secrets from each other or feel jealousy in their relationship. Unlike Tenebrous, who kept secrets Plagueis only found out after his former master's death, the moon wanted him and Sidious to be in sync and be in perfect harmony, all for the betterment of the dark side. He wanted to break the cycle where the apprentice eventually kills the master, and seeks for them to rule together for eternity, two individuals at the height of power. Shortly after his training began, Sidious inherited the Sith Archives, a knowledge bank with 1,000 years worth of knowledge passed down from one Sith master to the apprentice. Upon examining the archives, Sidious learned that Sith Lords harbored secrets from each other because they focused on their own goals. But Plagueis saw it differently. Plagueis and Sidious were supposed to have the same goals, where both would rule their own fields. Unlike Tenebrous, who held knowledge and power from Plagueis, the Moon Sith taught everything he knew to Palpatine out of fear that the power he had collected would be lost forever. Sidious trained under his master over the course of decades. During his training, Sidious had to face his fears, understand the absence of pleasure, and how to use his negative emotions to master the dark side. Chapter 7. Laying the Foundation of the Grand Plan. Training Sidious to be his equal in power and knowledge was only a small part of the Grand Plan. 1,000 years ago, Darth Bane initiated the Grand Plan together with the Rule of Two. His goal was to keep the Sith's survival a secret, all while passing power and knowledge down from a master to an apprentice. The goal was for the apprentice to surpass the master and take on another apprentice, who also had to surpass the master. In doing so, every generation of Sith would be stronger than the previous one. The Grand Plan involved every generation of master and apprentice to lay down the bricks of discord and political chaos, to destabilize not only the Republic, but its protectors, the Jedi Order from within. Plagueis believed that it was during his era that the Grand Plan would finally come to fruition. To this end, he and Palpatine needed to steadily lay down the foundations of their plan early enough to keep things in steady motion in preparation for the fall of the Jedi. The first step toward success in the plan was that the Sith needed a figurehead in the political battlefield to plunge the Republic into chaos. Plagueis himself had played his role as an industrialist amassing assets and allies. Now he needed someone to amass political power, and Palpatine was the perfect candidate for that. So, during one of the Sojourn gatherings, he and Sidious decided the galaxy was ripe for the taking from a political standpoint. Palpatine had to become part of the Galactic Senate. Thus, Palpatine orchestrated the assassination of the current Senator of Naboo, Vidar Kim. With the previous senator gone, Palpatine stepped up as a candidate, eventually winning and taking his seat on the Galactic Senate of Coruscant. With that, the Sith had their end to the chamber of the highest power in the Republic. Now, all Palpatine had to do was amass power and popularity as a senator. He used a rather subtle approach as a senator, becoming friendly with powerful individuals instead of contradicting their views. He allowed everyone to look down on him, subtly feeding the egos of the other senators while also making friends with political leaders from large and small systems alike. Palpatine never wanted to rush his rise to power, in accordance with his master's will. Instead, they both agreed that it was best for him to slowly yet steadily grow his influence as a politician. The act worked, and Palpatine became one of the most popular senators among his fellow members of the Senate, and even the common people. Plagueis, meanwhile, turned his studies back toward the Midi-Chlorians. The bigger part of the plan for both of them to rule eternally needed them to become immortal, and he knew that the Midi-Chlorians held the key to that quest. Any day he wasn't required to fill a public role as Hego Damask was dedicated toward his research on the Midi-Chlorians. In 52 BBY, Plagueis made contact with Kaminoans, a race of people living in Kamino beyond the Outer Rim. The Kaminoans were the best in the known galaxy at cloning, a technology indispensable for Plagueis. He wanted the Kaminoans to create a powerful clone army to eradicate the Jedi Order. After all, two Sith Lords, no matter how powerful they may be, would never be enough to defeat thousands of Jedi. The original plan was for the Kaminoans to use Yanchori clones because they were naturally immune to many Force powers. However, the Kaminoans rejected the idea because the Yanchori were so naturally aggressive that it would be extremely hard to control them in an organized military setup. This would also make it unlikely for them to obey orders, an important aspect in the eventual downfall of the Jedi. So, Plagueis had to set this part of the plan aside. But while the plan to create clones had to be suspended for now, Plagueis encountered a man who would soon become an important piece of the conflicts to come. During a meeting hosted by Count Vemic of Sereno, Damask participated in a talk attended by a small group of Jedi, namely Jocasta Nu, Sifo Dyas, Qui-Gon Jinn, and Dooku. The meeting involved a dispute between Sereno and Selenon over a hyperwave transceiver. But while Plagueis and Damask Holdings also had a stake in that meeting because he wanted to sow discord between several companies and systems, what the secret Sith Lord noticed was Dooku's increasing dissatisfaction with the Republic. While Dooku was one of the strongest and most skilled Jedi Masters in the Order, he was steadily losing faith in the Republic. But it was not because the system was flawed, but only because the people running it were corrupt. He believed more senators were involved in corruption, often only enriching their pockets and chasing individual interests instead of helping the galaxy as a whole. Plagueis sensed this growing discontent within the Jedi Master, eventually thinking he could recruit Dooku as a backup to Sidious in case he lost his apprentice. Plagueis also took this opportunity to engage in a discussion with the Jedi to further understand the motivations and viewpoints of his enemies, without them knowing who he truly was. Chief among his dissenters was Qui-Gon Jinn, Dooku's former Padawan. Qui-Gon accused Damask Holdings of trying to ferment chaos in the Outer Rim to profit from their issues and problems. However, Dooku and Sifo Dyas thought differently. To them, Damask was talking about an inevitable conflict with the Republic, specifically an impending split between the core and outer systems, while Dooku agreed wholeheartedly that the Senate was corrupt and that he wanted to correct the flaws within the Republic. Sifo Dyas was a bit more soft-spoken about his opinions because he was still loyal to the Republic. It was right then and there that Plagueis realized a big weakness within the Jedi Order. At that point, the Jedi had become so righteous and obedient to the Republic that they were willing to look past corrupt senators and leaders because this would make them appear as enemies of peace and justice. The Jedi believed they existed only to protect the Republic instead of correcting it. So, knowing that the Jedi Order would do everything in its power to fight for the Republic, Plagueis realized that the best way to defeat them was not by creating a clone army to fight them. Instead, he needed an army that the Jedi would trust enough to fight alongside, especially when the Republic's existence was at stake. The Jedi he shared his vision with was Sifo Dyas, the one who feared the most for the Republic. Sifo Dyas was loyal to the Republic to a fault, but it was his fear of losing the Republic that made him the most vulnerable out of all the Jedi present in that meeting. So, Plagueis was about to tell him about the cloners on Kamino, only for the dark side of the Force to tell him to suspend its plans upon seeing that Jocasta Nu was about to speak to them. Plagueis never stopped grooming Dooku and Sifo Dyas as potential allies he could manipulate. Upon returning to Coruscant, Plagueis told Palpatine about the pair of Jedi Masters who were prone to the dark side, and could be beneficial sometime later. Chapter 8. Taking a Back Seat. In 52 BBY, Plagueis attended a gathering hosted by the Order of the Canted Circle. This was a meeting between some of the most powerful people in the industrial sector, including many moons from Damask Holdings. With Plagueis about to be initiated into the group, everyone needed to wear black robes that hid their faces. However, it was all a trap. Not too long later, several attendees of the gathering threw their cloaks and revealed themselves as Maladian assistants, sent to kill the powerful leaders in that secretive order. The assassins threw countless decapitator discs that cut down several of the moons. While the Dark Lord of the Sith was powerful, the retrovirus that infected him years ago upon Tenebrous' death took away much of his ability to sense the future. Thus, he didn't sense this danger coming. One of the discs had severed his trachea and blood vessels on the side of his throat. For any normal being, the injury would have killed him, but Plagueis was a Sith Lord after all, and his skill in the Force allowed him to shut his wounds down to prevent blood loss while keeping himself conscious. Enraged, he mounted his own counterattack, ripping apart the assassin using the dark side of the Force. Luckily for him, Palpatine had learned of the assassination attempt on Plagueis before the meeting began, and was already on his way. He arrived just in time, finding his master fighting for his life. Palpatine ignited his lightsaber and made quick work of the remaining assassins. Plagueis survived the attack but was left seriously injured. The decapitator disc that nearly ended his life took off a considerable part of the moon's lower face. These injuries henceforth forced him to wear a transpirator that covered his face below the nose to keep himself alive. His brush with death made him understand the mortality of his existence. Not even a Sith Lord of his power was immune to death, making Plagueis more obsessed than ever with the preservation of his life. From here on out, he lived a secluded life in his laboratory, devoting his time and energy entirely to the study of Midi-Chlorians, eventually using them to heal himself partially from his wounds. Hego Damask had all but vanished from the public eye. He learned more about the nature of Midi-Chlorians, seeking to manipulate their power for his own benefit. He gave the implementation and reins of the Grand Plan entirely to Palpatine, having Palpatine update him on their progression. Palpatine himself was fully devoted to the political side, becoming more and more influential in the Senate. During that time, Sidious also took in an apprentice of his own, a Dathomirian Zabrak he named Darth Maul. It was rare for a Sith apprentice to take on his own apprentice with the Master's consent. Other apprentices had apprentices of their own but kept them secret. On the other hand, Plagueis was aware of Maul's existence, because Sidious trained him under his Master's watchful eye. But he allowed Sidious to take Maul in, not because he was supposed to replace him according to the rule of two. Instead, Plagueis thought Maul could be a useful tool and assassin for the Sith. Despite his secluded nature, Plagueis still pulled a few strings that consolidated more assets to their side. The Trade Federation, a group of Neimoidian merchants and businessmen, had grown into a large cartel that controlled much of the galaxy's trade routes, eventually monopolizing trade in different parts of the Republic. Plagueis and Palpatine agreed that they needed influence on this powerful company. The Dark Lord went on to broker a secret deal where the Trade Federation would develop some of the trade zones in the Outer Rim for the Republic. In exchange, the Trade Federation received a seat in the Galactic Senate as if the cartel were a planetary system. These secret negotiations with both the Trade Federation and the Republic allowed Plagueis to secure the Neimoidians' loyalty, and now had direct access to their highest members. Furthermore, he helped them secure a deal to harvest plasma from Naboo, as he still had his contacts with King Tapalo. For the next 20 years, Plagueis kept devoting himself to his studies and writing all of it down into a book he called the Book of Sith. Throughout this time, he denied himself of any sleep in order to always keep his guard up. He shall not be surprised again. His life was too precious. Plagueis' stance on the Force was that instead of looking at it as a mystical being that needed to be revered and worshipped, he sought to understand it from a purely scientific context. For him, the Force was not a mystical entity that could never be understood. That was the Jedi way of thinking. Instead, he tried to examine its objective nature to get a deeper understanding of what the Force truly was. To understand the nature of the Force was to find a way to manipulate it for his own benefit. To say that the Force works in mysterious ways is to admit one's ignorance, for any mystery can be solved through the application of knowledge and unrelenting effort. As we had our way with the Senate, and as we will soon have our way with the Republic and the Jedi, we will have our way with the Force. He accepted the classification of the Force into 3 categories. The first is the Eparian, which is the equivalent of the unifying force, the aspect of the Force that surrounds and unites every being in the galaxy. Then there's the Anima, which is the equivalent of the living force, the energy of all life forms. Finally, there was the Pneuma, the conscious thought that's expressed in the Force. Plagueis' focus on Midi-Chlorians was because he believed they had a uniquely strong connection to all these 3 aspects of the Force. In his mind, understanding this unique connection would allow him to master life and death. But at that point, he not only wanted to overcome death, but also master life, in the sense of actually manipulating the Midi-Chlorians to create life. He also sought to explore the possibility of using the Midi-Chlorians to manipulate space-time and the preservation of consciousness after death. In his quest to find answers to his questions and try to prove whether or not there is life after death, Plagueis left his lab and traveled to Korriban, the old seat of the Sith Empire thousands of years ago. He hoped to make contact with the soul of a long-dead Sith, only for him to encounter the legendary Marka Ragnos' soul in a vision. But while the Sith Lord, who lived more than 5,000 years ago, challenged Plagueis' claim to the title of Dark Lord, he never answered any of his questions. Upon regaining his consciousness, Plagueis assumed it was only a mere hallucination. The trip didn't help him much to his dismay. He came back and went back to his studies. At some point, as his research and progression advanced, he felt confident enough that he might be able to manipulate the legend of the Chosen One. According to the prophecy, a Chosen One uniquely powerful in the Force would one day come to restore balance by destroying the Sith. However, Plagueis believed he could use this prophecy to his advantage by using the Chosen One not as a savior of the Jedi, but as an extension of his will. He was confident that mastering the art of manipulating Midi-Chlorians would make this a trivial matter. Throughout his studies, Plagueis often used Venomous's body as a test subject. To test his theories about life and death, he proceeded to kill him after having kept him in a coma for decades. Then he used his knowledge of Midi-Chlorians to resurrect Venomous, succeeding in that experiment. At that moment, he gleefully realized that he was one step closer to overcoming death. It was a feat no one had accomplished up until this point in the history of the Sith. In the coming weeks, he repeated the process of killing and reviving Venomous to completely master the process. Plagueis brought Palpatine in and updated him on the progression of his studies and showed him how he could revive and kill Venomous. Palpatine was most intrigued. No other Sith in history had been capable of this feat before to their knowledge. Eventually, though, Venomous died a permanent death when his organs could no longer support the tedious process. To that end, Plagueis realized that even if he could resurrect someone from the dead, the original body was still a mortal shell that could give out. He understood that if he wanted to have complete mastery over death, he had to transfer a soul from one body to another, a knowledge his former master had almost perfected. The problem, however, was that he was yet to master this aspect of the dark side. But death wasn't the only thing he wanted to master. He also found that the Midi-Chlorians could be used to create life. Perhaps even a vessel purely made from the Force that could then hold his essence should his body fail, just like with Venomous. Together with Palpatine, Plagueis entered into a meditative state where he and his apprentice sought to shift the balance of the Force in favor of the dark side. Plagueis then took it one step further, mentally reaching out to the inhabitants of the galaxy and using the Force to influence the Midi-Chlorians to try and create life. He wanted a being of his own creation and engineering, but it was a blatant violation of the nature of the Force. He and Sidious poured their malice into the Force, using it to influence the Midi-Chlorians to heed their call and bring forth a being of their engineering. However, their efforts were in vain, as Plagueis realized the Force ignored his commands. Shortly after their attempt to create life, Plagueis noticed that all his test subjects succumbed to diseases. He theorized that this was feedback from the Force itself. What he and Sidious did was so unnatural that the Force had to oppose the Sith's efforts. It was a big setback. Chapter 9: The Naboo Invasion. Nearly a decade after the failed attempt to manipulate the Force into creating life, Plagueis and Sidious worked in tandem to coerce the Yanchori into an aggressive war just after they were admitted into the Republic. These people were once the ideal clone candidates for Plagueis in his attempt to destroy the Jedi, but because they were far too aggressive to control, he realized it was best to destroy the Yanchori as they had the ability to resist Force powers, a quality that threatened the Sith. The bloodshed eliminated the Yanchori as potential dangers to a future Sith rule. More importantly, the inability to peacefully resolve the situation with the Yanchori thoroughly weakened Chancellor Finis Valorum's position as the leader of the Republic. Palpatine, being a popular senator, wasn't enough for the Grand Plan to succeed. It was necessary for him to become the Supreme Chancellor, the leader of the entire Republic. For that to happen, they needed Valorum out of power in a subtle yet resounding way. Throughout the years, they kept sowing distrust and weakened Valorum's position. With that, more and more systems lost confidence in the Chancellor's leadership, creating the necessary circumstances for Palpatine to eventually take over as the new Chancellor. Sometime later that year, King Ars Viruna of Naboo requested Palpatine's presence on Theed during a time when there was political strife. The young leader, Padme Naberi, had been threatening Varuna's re-election as the ruling monarch. He suspected that Palpatine had been working against him by supporting Padme and undermining his relationship with the Trade Federation. To that end, there were no friendly faces around the Sith apprentice. Sidious was surrounded by malicious individuals, most of whom were gangsters and terrorists. Varuna informed Palpatine he was aware of his political ambitions. He was also made aware that he would no longer serve as a senator and that he was never going to see Damask ever again. It turned out that Varuna had planned an assassination on Plagueis on Sojourn, where he was conducting his experiments. Luckily for Plagueis, he had allied himself with the interplanetary gangster Jabba the Hutt. The two had previously agreed on a partnership where Jabba would feed Plagueis information about the Bando Gora terrorist that had been targeting some of Damask's allies. In exchange for that information, Damask Holdings had to cut out their support for Gardula Bisadi the Elder, one of Jabba's rivals. Jabba eventually learned that the same Bando Gora terrorist had been sent by Varuna to Sojourn to bomb the planet. Upon learning of the latest attempt on his life, the Moon Sith Lord destroyed every test subject and data in his lab before promptly escaping. Ships arrived to bombard Sojourn before finally destroying the moon using a nuclear device. Plagueis miraculously survived the attempt on his life, shocking Varuna. The king of Naboo, terrified, abdicated his throne and ran for his life, knowing that his enemies were out for revenge. Plagueis and Sidious conferred, with Palpatine suggesting they send Maul after the former king, but Plagueis objected. He wanted to eliminate the man who nearly killed him and forced him to abandon his experiments himself. Upon finding Varuna, Plagueis revealed his true identity as the Dark Lord of the Sith before telling them he was the one responsible for his rise to the throne of Naboo. The Sith Lord then killed him by slowly manipulating the limited amount of Midi-Chlorians in the former king. Killing Varuna not only strengthened him and satisfied his lust for revenge, but also added more fuel to the fires of a civil war. With Varuna gone, Padme rose to the throne of Naboo, becoming Queen Amidala and ending the line of kings. Amidala's policies went against the Trade Federation, imposing additional taxes on the plasma they harvested from the planet to protect the interest of the inhabitants of Naboo. The policies angered the Trade Federation enough for them to consider aggressive tactics against Naboo. This all playing into the grand plan of the Sith. What Plagueis didn't know was that in fact it was Sidious who had secretly manipulated Varuna to divert his anger toward Damask and eventually convince him to try and assassinate him. Plagueis thought naively that Sidious would want to share the power and all was in perfect harmony between them, blindly trusting Sidious that he'd go along with his break with the rule of two. Meanwhile, the Republic, through Palpatine's manipulation on Chancellor Valorum, decided to impose taxes on the Trade Federation's free trade routes. The Trade Federation was outraged. Viceroy Newt Gunray, the leader of the Trade Federation, who had been planted at the head by Sidious and Plagueis, followed their every command. Sidious told him that he had to make a blockade around Naboo. Gunray followed swiftly and proceeded with the blockade on Sidious's order. The Trade Federation threatened the Republic that any attempt to break the embargo would be met with aggression, and that if their demands were not met, the people of Naboo would die of starvation. This event should further show the galaxy how ineffective Valorum and the Republic were to protect its member worlds. To the Sith's surprise, though, Chancellor Valorum called up the Jedi Order for help to negotiate with the Trade Federation. Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn and his Padawan Obi-Wan Kenobi were selected to try to reason with the Newt Gunray. This was an unexpected move, as the Sith believed the chances of the Jedi interfering with the blockade were minimal at best, because the Senate had placed restrictions on the Chancellor to use the Jedi Order as he pleased. Previous events that led to tragedy in different parts of the galaxy also made the Sith think that the Senate was reluctant to use the Jedi to clear this mess up. But Valorum went behind the Senate's back to resolve the mess, even if it meant losing the trust of the entire Senate. Plagueis and Sidious were afraid of what could happen if the Jedi were to interfere with the blockade. If Jinn and Kenobi were to dive deeper into the Trade Federation's motives for the blockade, there was a chance they would eventually uncover the connection between Newt Gunray and the Sith Lords. Neimoidians, the race of people that made up the Trade Federation, were notorious for being cowardly. There was an extremely high chance of them revealing to the Jedi everything they knew about the Sith, especially if they were backed into a corner. In retaliation, Plagueis and Sidious accelerated their plans, ordering the Trade Federation to kill the Jedi before any negotiations were to be conducted. Initially, the plan was merely to blockade Naboo. However, with the Jedi interfering, Sidious ordered the full-scale invasion of Naboo. The Sith Lords had hoped that the Trade Federation would do its part by killing the Jedi ambassadors. Meanwhile, the invasion of Naboo would force Amidala to sign a treaty that would allow the Trade Federation to completely own the planet's plasma reserves, making the Neimoidian occupation of Naboo completely legal. With the plan moving at a rate faster than ever, Plagueis believed that it was the will of the dark side that they finally reveal the existence of the Sith to the galaxy, to which Sidious replied that he would see to it that Darth Maul was ready for that revelation. Unsurprisingly to them, the Trade Federation failed to kill Jyn and Kenobi. The Jedi pair, meanwhile, rescued Queen Amidala and escaped the planet with her, much to the anger of both the Trade Federation and Sith. Sidious went as far as sending Darth Maul to go after Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi shortly after their escape from Naboo, believing that the Jedi stood no chance against his apprentice. While Sidious was manipulating the Naboo situation from both sides as a Sith Lord and as Senator Palpatine, Plagueis was accelerating another important part of the Grand Plan. He was in a political gathering hosted by Valorum. Several Jedi Masters were present, including Sifo-Dyas, Yoda, and Mace Windu. Plagueis specifically targeted Sifo-Dyas, preying on his fears of an impending civil war. The problem was that the Jedi Council was unwilling to listen to Dyas' worries about war, even as the signs were already there. Plagueis tempted Dyas with the possibility of an army that could defend the Republic from the inevitable civil war. He told him that the time was nigh because they needed to create the army as soon as possible to give the Republic a fighting chance when the fires of war finally broke out. 20 years ago, Dyas was still more skeptical, but because it was now clear that conflicts within the Republic were showing signs of discord among different systems, he bought into Plagueis' idea that a growing darkness was indeed approaching. Plagueis then revealed the existence of the cloners on Kamino, information he wanted to share with Dyas 2 decades ago. He claimed the cloners could grow an army in time for a war, and that he had the funds to finance the entire undertaking through Damask Holdings' vast assets. Dyas was still hesitant to take action, but highly considered taking Plagueis' offer, not knowing that the Sith had been manipulating him the entire time. Chapter 10. The Arrival of the Chosen One. The Naboo crisis was ongoing when Palpatine learned of the existence of a very powerful Force-sensitive boy from Jedi Master Dooku. Dooku at this point had become a very good friend of his. The boy was Anakin Skywalker, a boy born into slavery on the outskirt planets of Tatooine, far from the Republic's influence and the Jedi Order's senses. He had been brought to Coruscant by Qui-Gon Jinn, who sensed Anakin's potential early on. Qui-Gon confirmed that Anakin's Midi-Chlorian count was unprecedented, even higher than the one of Master Yoda. It was believed that he was the chosen one the prophecy said was meant to bring balance to the Force. Thus, Qui-Gon wanted to train him to become a Jedi. Intrigued, Palpatine informed Plagueis of this revelation. The Chosen One had actually arrived. Sidious felt that they could use Anakin's natural talent, hoping he could use him to his advantage in the future. On the other hand, Plagueis legitimately feared the young Skywalker's existence, especially after learning that he was born on 41 BBY, a year after their failed attempt at manipulating the Midi-Chlorians to create life by flooding the galaxy with the dark side of the Force. In his mind, Anakin was not just a generational talent, but actually stood at a vergence in the Force. He became convinced that the Force, enraged by his unnatural attempt at usurping the Force's power to create life, retaliated by creating Skywalker as the prophesized Chosen One, meant to destroy the Sith and bring balance back to the Force. His theory was supported by the fact that Anakin was born without a father, an immaculate conception that seemed to have been willed by the Force itself out of revenge for Plagueis' hubris. Plagueis was familiar with the prophecy of the Chosen One. In fact, Hego Damask's very existence was the product of Darth Tenebrous' desire to usurp the Chosen One's body. His former master manipulated the circumstances that led to his birth because he wanted to use Plagueis as his vessel before the coming of the Chosen One. But, unknown to both Tenebrous and Plagueis, the Chosen One most likely came about as an indirect result of their attempts to meddle with the Force. Had Tenebrous not brought about Plagueis' birth, Plagueis would not have existed to try to put the Force under his command. So, if the Moon Sith Lord was correct in believing that Anakin was the product of the Force's retaliation, the prophecy was directly tied to Plagueis' existence. That was why he feared Anakin's existence. But still, that did not stop him from wanting to meet the boy himself. On Coruscant, Plagueis snuck into Palpatine's suite where Anakin was staying. However, he didn't get a chance to meet him because Skywalker had just left the premises. This was the first time in his life that he realized the Force may have been working against him and the Grand Plan. He feared for the existence of the Sith, interpreting Anakin's existence as the Force's way of striking back at him and his apprentice for what they did a decade ago. So he shifted his priority. The goal was to prevent Anakin from becoming a Jedi. While that was happening, Amidala had decided to return to Naboo to liberate her people after putting forward a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum's reign to remove him from his post and elect a new Supreme Chancellor. Although this wasn't entirely planned for by the Sith, as they didn't anticipate the Senate already being willing to part with Valorum, they gladly took this opportunity. The Chancellor's seat was open, and none other than Palpatine was favored in contention to become the leader of the Republic. Everything they had been building towards for decades was falling in place. Now, the Naboo crisis wasn't of any use to them anymore. The Jedi accompanied the Queen back to Naboo and brought Anakin with them, as he was denied to be trained as a Jedi by the Council. Right before their departure from Coruscant, Plagueis managed to catch a quick glimpse at the supposed Chosen One. Seeing him, even though from a distance and only for a split second, gave Plagueis a vision in the Force. He saw a figure in dark armor, a glimpse of Darth Vader himself. Plagueis realized that this boy would change the course of history. More than ever, he was determined to prevent the child from becoming a Jedi. So, just before Amidala and the Jedi arrived on Naboo, Plagueis ordered Sidious to have Darth Maul prioritize killing Qui-Gon Jinn, the man who defied the Jedi Council's will so that he could personally take Anakin under his wing. Sidious, meanwhile, also ordered Maul to kill Kenobi as insurance, because he knew that Obi-Wan would take Anakin as his Padawan if ever something were to happen to Qui-Gon. Chapter 11, The Tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. Plagueis and Sidious were delighted that the Grand Plan was moving forward according to their expectations. Every puzzle piece set up to this point had fallen in place and acted as they had planned. Valorum had been ousted from the Chancellorship, with Palpatine on the verge of becoming the Chancellor of the Republic. Meanwhile, he was certain that the Kaminoans were soon to start their work to create the clones that would bring the demise of the Jedi Order. On the night before Palpatine's inauguration to become Chancellor, the Master and Apprentice celebrated in the Moon's penthouse suite on Coruscant, drowning themselves in Celestin wine. Plagueis was at his happiest, for he knew that they were now closer than ever to fulfilling the Grand Plan. He even allowed his personal security to take the night off, because he believed that his apprentice would be enough protection. On Plagueis' request, Palpatine rehearsed the speech he was going to give to the Senate the next day, correcting him at various points. The relationship between Plagueis and Sidious was, at first glance, a flourishing one. When Plagueis took Palpatine in as his apprentice, he told him this was the end of the Rule of Two, because he and Sidious would be working in harmony without any secrets between them. For the longest time, Plagueis thought he could completely trust his apprentice, because he never saw any sparks of betrayal in Palpatine's eyes. But what he didn't know was that Sidious was far more selfish than he thought. Palpatine never intended to share power. Although he needed Plagueis up until this point, there was no way he'd have Plagueis be a co-chancellor behind the curtains. Plagueis drank so much wine that he started to sleep. For the first time in over 20 years, Plagueis was sleeping, as he had denied himself of that. At first, Sidious didn't think much about his master being in a vulnerable state. He was about to leave Plagueis alone in his deep and intoxicated slumber. But as soon as he was about to call it a night, Sidious heard the dark side calling out to him to kill his master. This was the very same situation Plagueis found himself in decades ago, when he heard the dark side telling him to kill Tenebrous in his most vulnerable state. Without any hesitation holding him back, Sidious turned around and shot a volley of Force lightning at the Dark Lord laying there in his sleep. Palpatine mocked his master for his moment of vulnerability as he poured all his malicious intent into his actions, eventually destroying Plagueis' breathing device and further weakening the Sith Lord. Before that, Plagueis never thought death would eventually come for him. He had mastered the art of manipulating Midi-Chlorians to such a degree that he could bring Darth Venomous back from death repeatedly during his experiments. However, the irony was that he never stopped to think whether or not he could prevent himself from dying. As Sidious continued throwing more lightning at him, Plagueis tried to fight back, even conjuring up a small force storm to try to protect himself. But the alcoholic intoxication was too much even for one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. He eventually succumbed to suffocation. As he died, Plagueis released an explosion of dark side energy as he knocked Sidious out and rippled through the entire planet. Damask, Darth Plagueis, Dark Lord of the Sith, was dead. Sidious was now the uncontested Sith Master and most powerful person in the galaxy. Epilogue. As Sidious stood there, having killed his master, he felt no remorse. He thanked Plagueis for his teachings and his part in implementing the Grand Plan of the Sith, but also cursed him for manipulating him into killing his parents all these years ago. On Naboo, Maul succeeded in killing Jyn, but fell at the hands of Kenobi. Palpatine was inaugurated the next day and would learn of Maul's loss, which occurred at the same time as his victory over Plagueis. During Qui-Gon's funeral, Obi-Wan promised Anakin that he would become a Jedi, as willed by his fallen master. Meanwhile, Qui-Gon's death eventually convinced Dooku to leave the Jedi and take his seat as Serenu's new Count. He would soon thereafter join Sidious and become his apprentice. Sifo-Dyas, meanwhile, decided that an army for the Republic was necessary, the words of Hego Damask echoing in his mind. He approached the Kaminoans and commissioned the creation of a clone army for the Republic behind the backs of both the Jedi Order and the Galactic Senate by using the funds he received from Damask Holdings. Plagueis unfortunately never saw the fruition of his work. The very vision that forced Darth Tenebrous to abandon his quest of taking over his former apprentice's body had proven to be correct. His seclusion in the last 20 years also made him become a forgotten figure in the wider galaxy, as he was out of the public eye for as long as most people remembered. Darth Sidious eventually grew to be more powerful than Darth Plagueis ever was. But while his former master supposedly taught him everything he knew, Sidious never fully mastered the ability to cheat death by manipulating Midi-Chlorians to the same degree of his master. The final legacy that Plagueis would lay would be in Palpatine's manipulation attempts to turn the Chosen One to the dark side. By using his master's attempts to create life as a story, he was able to convince Anakin that such a feat was possible, ultimately leading the young Jedi to become a Sith Lord at Palpatine's side. Indeed, it was ironic that the being obsessed with cheating death and living eternally could have succeeded if it wasn't for the Sith's nature to consolidate all power to themselves. Plagueis going against that rule ultimately led to his own demise, despite all his wisdom in the Force. That was the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise.